Well, transgender athletes continue to press for opportunity in the Olympics. New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard just completed in Tokyo. She was the first ever openly transgender woman to participate in the Games. And when it comes to the topic of naturally high levels of testosterone, is there really a fair and sensitive way to level the playing field? Earlier, I turned to the Science of Sport podcast co-host Ross Tucker for answers. Take a listen. Ross, you're a world-renowned sports scientist, and this is an ongoing debate. Can you have a sport with trans athletes that's also fair and inclusive? Why is it so polarizing?
It's polarizing because I think the answer to that question, unfortunately, is no. I haven't seen any research or evidence that would suggest that you can achieve both fairness and inclusion at the same time. So the root cause is that males, biological males who undergo development, puberty, under the influence of these testosterone and other hormones, have biological advantages that create enormous performance differences between men and women. And simply lowering the testosterone does not seem to undo all of them. It may reduce them, but certainly there seems to be retention of advantage. And so then when you get someone who enters the women's sport category having undergone male puberty and development, those advantages are retained. So the sport ultimately has to then choose between inclusion and fairness. And the reality then is that you can't keep both sides of the debate happy.
There was a lot of professional athletes who came out against the New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard performing in this Tokyo Olympics. This was an athlete who had previously competed in men's events and was now competing in women's events after undergoing a lot of testing. For those arguing that it's fair to include her, to have that, to be inclusive, they're saying, well, she didn't place a medal, therefore it is fair. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, the first point about advantage is that you don't assess advantage by the final outcome. In the same way that, for instance, if I was cycling in the Tour de France, I would come last. And if you gave me a bicycle that had an engine on it that contributed 100 watts, I would clearly have an advantage, but I would still come last. And so the final outcome in sport, the scoreboard, the placing, the medal that's won or lost, is not a function of the advantage only. It's a function of the base level of the athlete plus the advantage that they have. And if the base level is too low, then no amount of advantage is going to help. In the same way, another analogy is an athlete who uses banned drugs and dopes is definitely gaining a 5 to 8% advantage, let's say. But it doesn't guarantee that they'll win, because they may not start from a high enough position to surpass competitors who don't have that advantage. So I would encourage people to not simply look at the result on the scoreboard as indicative of an advantage. And then as for the athletes, I think they understand that there are, especially in that sport, weightlifters know that the difference between male and female performance is enormous. It's one of the largest, between 30 and 40% difference in strength. And you just can't undo that. There's an asymmetry where once testosterone has done its job, you can't take all of it away. So I think the athletes know this.
Testosterone was also an issue, Ross, when it came to track and field. There were two Namibian athletes who were banned from running in the 400 metres but were allowed to race in the 200 metres because it was deemed that their testosterone levels were out of the range of what is deemed average for a female athlete. Christine MBOMA won the silver in the 200 metres, and I'm wondering what you make of the argument that, well, you know, these levels of testosterone in her body were natural.
Yeah, this is the issue of DSDs, which stands for differences of sex development. And if the trans issue we just spoke about is complex, this is another level of complexity. It's the most difficult problem, I think, faced by sport. The problem that sport has got is that it's got very good reason to want to regulate women's sport as a category, because we have to keep a degree of protection or closure around women's sport so that we can keep people who benefit from those testosterone and other androgens out of women's sports space. But when you have individuals who have these DSDs, there's an ethical dilemma around whether sport gets to tell someone what gender or sex they are. Now, the World Athletics won the case at the Court of Arbitration when Caster Semenya challenged the policy. And they won it because their principle and their theory was so strong. What they didn't have very much of was good evidence for it. And the reason we now have this clumsy situation where an athlete can be illegal in the 400 but allowed to run the 200 is because that policy evolved in a very messy, untidy, paradoxical way. So the answer to your question is that they probably have advantages as a result of these male hormones. Remember that the policy only applies to people who are genetically male, have got internal testes, high levels of testosterone, and can then use that testosterone. But the problem for sport now is that they can't include the 200-meter event because of the way the policy developed over time. And it's going to be really interesting to see what they do with that next.
Yeah, it's a very relatively new issue because, as far as I understand it, it was only in 2018 after the Rio Olympics that officials decided to monitor testosterone levels. Explain why that matters and whether it's enough to level the playing field.
People have known for a very long time, I think, that male-female performance differences in sports are so large that if we didn't have a closed protected category for women, there would basically be no women in the Olympic Games. So women's sport as a category ensures that we can have and celebrate women's athletic performances. Now, the root cause for that is testosterone. And so when authorities were faced with this problem where you get people who either identify as women, as trans women, or DSDs, their thinking was that if we simply lowered the testosterone, we could take away the advantage and we'd have fairness and parity in women's sport. And so testosterone becomes the focal point in a sense because it's the fix. You know, we can fix this problem by lowering the testosterone. And so the initial version of the policy was called the hyperandrogenism regulation. So hyper meaning high, androgens like testosterone, it's a hormone. It's subsequently been changed to a DSD, but the focus is still very much on testosterone as the cause and therefore the fix to the problem. Now, this has been around for decades. In 1936, it's reported that the first cases of what were then called intersex or DSD athletes was around. It's never been solved by sport, and I think the latest with these two Namibian sprinters is going to make it even more complex because now authorities again have to ask the question, what do we do? Do we add the 200, and if so, on what basis? Or do we leave it? And in that case, we've got this paradoxical policy across events, very untidy.
We will continue to follow this, but we'll have to leave it there for now. Ross Tucker, sports scientist, good to have you with us. Thanks so much. Well, that does it for this edition of One World. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Linda KINKADE. Stick around, African Voices is up next. You're watching CNN.